Hi all, and welcome to a presentation on enhancing accessibility by integrating support for color vision deficiency into your open educational resource. So who are we? Katlyn and Jen were from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Nick is from the University of Victoria in Victoria, BC. Through this presentation, we want you to be able to recall the types of color vision deficiency, identify common challenges that individuals with color vision deficiency may face in the classroom or workforce, and to describe concepts, tools, and modifications that can be integrated into open educational resources to improve accessibility for people with CVD or color vision deficiency. So what is color vision deficiency? It's the inability or difficulty to distinguish certain colors. Our color vision is dependent on cone cells that are in our eyes, and people with CVD, they often lack one or more of these cone cells. In protanopia, people lack the red cone cell, which leads them to confuse red, green, brown, and purple. In deuteranopia, people lack the green cone cell, which leads them to confuse red, green, blue, and purple. And tritanopia, where people lack the blue cone cell, which leads them to confuse blue, green, and yellow. CVD is for the most part genetic, and that's why we see males are more affected than females. About 1 in 12 males are affected by it and about 1 in 200 females. But overall, it affects about 9% of the world's population, which is a decent amount. So here's a photo of apples, and we put different filters on it so you can see what the world looks like to people with different forms of CVD. There's also a less common form of CVD known as red desaturation that you can get by damaging your optic nerve. Unlike inherited CVD, since a red desaturation is not genetic, it affects men and women equally, and the degree of deficiency varies by person. On the right, you can see an image of a fire extinguisher. On the left, it is fully saturated, and on the right, we have desaturated the image, and this is what someone with red desaturation would see. Like inherited CVD, there's currently no cure, but with accommodations, people with it can live a very normal life.
So, Kat has given a really great overview about what CBD is and how people essentially perceive the world with it. It would be great to have an example in kind of an education context so that we can kind of frame our reference to how students and maybe even educators live with and have to teach or learn with this disability. And so, what we want to cover in this example is experiment 3, which in our course discusses how to use indicators to distinguish acidic, basic, and neutral solutions. So, there are 3 primary learning outcomes for this experiment. One, we want to introduce the difference between a strong and weak acid or base. We would then want to describe general acid and base theory to students, and we want them to be able to identify acids and bases using colored indicator solutions that we provide them in lab. And so shown over here in the figure on the right, we have example theory that we provide students, both with respect to strong and weak acids, as well as bases, as they are conjugate pairs, as well as an example image of what students might actually use in the laboratory, which is the 5 unknown clear solutions, as well as a spot plate with some colored indicators. So, while on paper this is a very straightforward experiment, and in practice it generally is as well, it's not a very demanding experiment on our students, one of the learning outcomes does require the use of full color vision, which as we've discussed in Kat's section, isn't necessarily a valid assumption to make. And as you can kind of see through the GIF here, the way that students perceive these different indicator solutions, particularly the differences in the universal indicator and the metacresal purple indicator, really make this an extra challenge for students who don't have full color vision. And so what that means is that one of our learning outcomes is inherently flawed for students, and what we care about is not necessarily the perception of color, which is what we're assessing currently, but the interpretation of that color is far more important. So for example, it's not about what color is this, it's about this is this color, what does that mean? And that's a very important distinction to make when trying to teach new concepts to students. Now, while in an in-person setting it's very difficult to deal with these or some of these considerations, we decided to first take a look at our online content to see what we could improve there. And as it turns out, there were a number of things that could be improved upon, the first of which is taking better photos. So not all students are going to have a very high-quality screen to look at when doing online modules or online content in general. And so the higher quality of photo you provide, the better a chance you have of improving their learning outcomes. So what we did here is between the fall of 2020 and fall of 2021 is we took more professional photos that had improved contrast and minimized shadows. And what this does is it provides a better contrast for students to be able to perceive color, hopefully therefore minimizing any confusions they might have. But in addition to increasing the contrast of these images, we wanted to take advantage of the online medium even further, and so what we did is we added in a pH meter overlay on top of the solution while it was running during the fall of 2022. So if you remember one of our learning outcomes from earlier, which was to identify acids and bases using colored solutions, we put into question that learning outcome specifically because it relied on perception and not interpretation. With the addition of something like a pH meter overlay, what we're doing is not only providing a qualitative indicator, with that being color, we're also providing something quantitative for students to perceive, that being an actual pH counter. And what this does is it creates an environment where students can now either use qualitative or quantitative methods to assess their pH of their solution, and from there they're able to make reasonable interpretations about that data to lead them to the conclusion of whether a species is acid, base, or neutral. I'd like to now pass it over to Jen to wrap up our presentation.
Thanks, Nick. Let's now explore some strategies for building CVD-friendly content. When building CVD-friendly content, it's helpful not to eliminate color entirely, but instead consider your color palette carefully. Simulating what your color palette may look like to others ensures that the colors you've selected appear unique to as many people as possible. We also want to avoid using color as the sole communicator of information. Pairing color with text, pattern, or animation can help support your CVD content users. If you happen to be building your course content or your open educational resource with a team of authors, one way that you can help to make sure that you're building CVD-friendly content is to keep clear records of your color choices and codes, color combinations that you want to avoid or which may generate poor contrast for the viewer, and also share this with the team that you're co-creating content with. You may also want to keep record of things like your title font, main fonts, or any sort of design elements that you may be using consistently throughout your work. Looking at a quick example, in the graph on the right, there's a series of traces, one yellow, red, green, and blue. However, the data is only communicated through color. There is a poor contrast with the background for the yellow trace, making it very difficult to see, and there's potential for reduced contrast between the traces for individuals with CVD. By considering alternate modes of presenting the same data, we are able to improve the previous graph by combining color with pattern rather than just color alone, and also improving the contrast, specifically on the yellow trace where we've added a black outline so that the contrast with the background is now higher. We've paired the image with the numerical data table as an alternate way of communicating the same information. So overall, these minor changes have improved communication of the data for all viewers. So if you're interested in learning more about how you can apply these concepts to your own course materials and your open educational resources, Nick, Kat, and I are bringing it all together through an OER book titled Navigating Color Vision Deficiency in Science Education. You're welcome to add yourself to the mailing list to be notified when the OER is released using the QR code on the slide or at tinyurl.com/colorsoer. And lastly, here are the references mentioned in the presentation, as well as our team contact and resources. Thanks for listening.